Hey everyone, it's Gillian Monster, and I just want to say thank you all for being here today to watch this another Kerbal Space Program video of mine. I'm still trying to figure out how exactly open broadcast software works, so please forgive me if there's anything not quite up to your specifications. But I mean, if you want to help me out, then you can give me some pointers. But this is what's left of my USS Wanderer project. You'll see it, I think, in my Fuel Lines public service announcement. And what you're about to see is the problem that kept that project from working and why it is split in half. Yeah, and wait for it. And gonna start blinking. Boom. Okay, yeah, there it goes. So yeah, that is what's called a thermal runaway for a battery, or in the case of Kerbal Space Program, a programming bug. Basically, because I had used those big disc-shaped batteries, it's basically the only link between several points on my on the USS Wanderer. That glitch kept occurring. I tried some remedies from the internet and it just didn't quite work. So I decided to abandon it, basically split it in half and use its remains as I guess you could say project fodder. And what you're looking at right now is the the nuclear recovery vehicle. You see the name called NUCOG, and it's basically designed to bring down the Wanderer's nuclear reactor in one piece. Which, if we ever shift over to nuclear-powered aircraft, that's going to be the trick, is getting those things out of orbit without them disintegrating to a million little radioactive pieces. But the whole point of this video is my methodology for building space planes, and it is actually a fully scalable concept. Now you'll notice that I actually use whiplash engines and chemical rocket engines, and the reason why is because that provides a more challenging engineering problem to be solved than using, say, the RAPIER engines, which are actually a pretty impressive piece of real life technology. I didn't know that they had actually made any functional variations of it, not necessarily for flight, but they've completed several successful tests. And the way that I make my space planes is I was trying to make something kind of like a Mark II fuselage. The one you just saw was actually the functional version after I discovered this little trick. But it was barely having enough fuel to get into orbit and come back down, and it basically had to glide in almost like the space shuttle. And I wanted it to have a bit more flexibility, and I think it could get up to about 85,000 meters as max flight ceiling if I wanted to have enough fuel to come back down. And so I decided to kind of go big or go home. So I decided to build a Mark III space plane, and that was the first version you saw, the kind of the fatter, stubbier one. And that was basically just a test to see, okay, if I want to say get up to 100,000 meters, how much fuel am I going to need? So I basically loaded it down with at least one whiplash. First off, you got to build your space plane, drain it of all its fuel, and then you want to, for the remainder of it, like say you have 70 or say 70 tons of empty spacecraft left over, then you want to add roughly one whiplash for every 10 tons. And of course, give yourself a little bit more room to play with. So that one was loaded out with 8. In this case, this one's a lot bigger. It's 100 and I want to say it's like 80 tons empty. So this thing actually has 10. So it's got a little bit more power. But so one whiplash engine per 10 tons, and then for the once you have all the functional bits, meaning the engines, the cockpit, the wings, and space for fuel, then you can actually start scaling and you can actually start filling the fuselage with fuel. And the way that works is you want to give yourself about 130 liquid fuel and 130 oxidizer per ton of empty aircraft. So if you were, say, for just simplicity's sake, say if you're doing a 20 ton, if you find out your aircraft is 20 tons empty, then you want to give it 130 of both liquid fuel and oxidizers per ton. That comes out to roughly 2,600 units of each per ton. And the reason why you want them both to be equal is because you're not going to use any oxidizer until you start igniting your rocket engine. And you're going to end up using about 20% of your fuel to get to we'll call it rocket altitude, which is where the engines stop, not where they fully cut out, but where they actually stop accelerating your aircraft, and you have to use that rocket engine to give yourself the acceleration you need to get into orbit. So, and you'll see this later on in the video, is the flight pattern. Once you give yourself the allotted amount of fuel, and you take off and you climb at about a 15 to 20 degree angle, prograde, which means you actually, if your prograde is slightly below where your actual direction marker is, you want to have the prograde itself lined up with the 15 to 20 between 15 and 20 degrees of angle. And you'll just basically climb, and right about 10,000 meters or so is where you want to level down to, say, maybe 10, and you just want to maintain that until you pass about 800 meters per second, at which point you can start climbing. You can bring your prograde marker back up to about 15 degrees, and from there you basically just keep climbing until your engines stop giving your aircraft upwards acceleration, in which case you ignite your rocket engine and you let the remainder of your jet engine power and your rocket power carry you up. And then once your engine's fully cut out, you want to drop your prograde marker down to about 10 degrees, and you can basically ride that out all the way up to about 100,000 meters. And once you hit that apoapse of 100,000 meters, you can put yourself into a stable orbit. Now, the beauty about this little fuel to weight ratio, I guess you could call it, is that this will leave you with, we'll call it the padding fuel, and this gives you enough fuel to perform, if you know what you're doing, a few adjustment maneuvers, like say if you're trying to make a rendezvous with like a space station or something else. And then it'll also leave you, after that, it will leave you with enough fuel to successfully deorbit and come back down with a little bit of fuel left over for your jet engine, so you can come in for a powered landing. Like say, unlike the space shuttle, you'll actually have enough power to get up. I mean, the space shuttle actually has to glide, period. I mean, it has no engine power once it comes back down. But it'll leave you with enough engine power where if you need to, you can pick up a little bit of speed, come around and try again. Or what's called a toga, take off, go around. Which I actually had to do with this aircraft, which is, it just shows the flexibility of this particular design. Now, granted, of course, it's not nearly as fuel efficient as say something like a Rapier Central or a space plane designed with Rapier engines. But the thing is, this is more of, I guess you'd call it a conventional solution. And I don't know why, I was just absolutely obsessed with making this concept work. And I just happened to stumble onto the little fuel ratio at the right time, and sped all this up just because, you can see it just fine while it's sped up. But it actually does involve a little bit of active fuel pumping. Like say, because of the way jet engines burn, they try and burn all the fuel evenly stage by stage, whereas a rocket, I think it starts either from the bottom or from the top. Now, if you've got your rocket oriented almost vertical, that's not the balance of fuel isn't really going to be enough to throw the rocket off balance and cause it to tumble out of control. But if you're doing that with a space plane where you have all the fuel, say, to the rear or relatively spread out, the weight of the engines towards the back is going to make it, it's going to shift its center of mass behind its center of lift, and that is grounds to make this thing flip out of control. And you can see me here now, I'm actually cycling my fuel forward to give myself a little bit more directional stability. And in this case, I've actually got quite a bit of fuel. This particular space plane, I designed it to have roughly what I thought was a 5-ton payload, and it turns out it actually ends up being able to carry 8.2 tons total into space. Now, you might think that's a very low power to weight ratio, or would you say payload to weight ratio? I don't know, but it's a very small weight considering how big this aircraft actually is. And if you've ever looked up, say, an actual concept space plane, like what the British or if you're in the United Kingdom, you probably know about it. It's called the Skylon, and that's Skylon. And it is actually the first, or rather, probably one of the few space plane or single stage to orbit designs that has the real life equivalent called the Sabre or Rapier in Kerbal Space Program to actually primarily give it its power source. And it's got, I think it might have like an auxiliary booster in the back or something, in case something goes wrong. I'm not sure. But that thing can only carry 15, I want to say 15 and a half tons maybe, or roughly 33,000 pounds. But the entire aircraft, when it's fully fueled and yeah, when it's fully fueled, weighs 717,000 pounds. I mean, that to me is mind blowing. I mean, that's all like liquid hydrogen and helium and all that stuff, and it's just an oxidizer, and it just that is an insanely heavy aircraft. But the cool thing about the Sabre engines, we'll call them Rapier for now, is that they provide almost 3.5 times what a normal uh, what a normal jet engine can provide. I think a normal jet engine can provide about like a power to weight ratio of about 5 to 1. The uh, the Rapier engine, the real life equivalent, can provide 14 times its own weight. Like it can lift 14 times its own weight. At least I think that's how it goes. Anyway, it's insanely high. And the reason why it can do that is because of how it functions. It basically sucks in air as it's gaining altitude, and at the higher speeds, the more air is getting, I guess you could say, shoved into the intake. It causes the gas to compress and heat up. And normal jet engines, the way they counter this is by being made out of heavier metals, things that can take the heat. The way the Sabre works is it's got what's called a pre-cooler, and this thing actually has it's insane how this works. It'll take the incoming air from a temperature of like I want to say like 1,000 degrees centigrade to negative 150 in like a split second, like just an absolutely insanely short amount of time. And by cooling that rapidly cooling that air down, that leaves you able to compress it even further. So basically, you're taking all that heat, sucking it out, and then you're able to compress it even without increasing the internal heat of that engine. So it's providing 3.5 times the amount of compression and like driving force of a normal jet engine. And the cool thing is it maintains its efficiency as it goes up. I mean, you can look this stuff up on Wikipedia, and if you've got any sort of engineering inclination at all, you stare at the diagram long enough and you'll get it. That's pretty much what I had to do. But I mean, it's just insane that they actually got that something that like that to work. But this space plane is all just conventional propulsion, chemical rockets and jet engines. And this to me is probably like more something that would be practical now. Does it get to Duna? No, it doesn't have nearly enough fuel efficiency to do that. It can't even. I don't even think this design could get to the moon. I mean, of course, unless you give it enough engines and fuel to get there, which of course, that's just, you know, it's like the loading hint, adding more boosters. That's about what you'd have to do. And but this is actually also me showcasing a couple of the mods that I got. Like right here, this is I got this off KerbalStuff.com, and this is a mod where it actually gives the majority of the cockpits functional, multifunctional displays. Like you can see right there, that's one of the mods. It's called Vessel View RPM, and it'll actually show you like the general fuel status of each segment that holds fuel. It shows you your engine status, and it's like, say you've got something like air brakes, it'll actually show those deploying. Like if you hold down the brake button, that's just one of them. But that cockpit actually has like functional buttons. You could see me earlier in the video messing with them. It's got things like the control. You can turn your RCS on and off. It's got backlighting, and you can control your SAS. You can even see like the little joysticks and stuff moving around while I'm messing with the reaction control system while this thing was on the ground. And it's just an awesome thing. And because in conjunction with the camera mod or the exterior camera mods, it's also called Kerbal Stuff. You just type in camera and it'll probably pop up. It actually makes flying these things from the cockpit a possibility. Whereas before you literally had like kind of a semi-altimeter. I mean, you couldn't really read it, but yeah, it's just absolutely awesome. And if you'll notice here, the wings here have kind of like a double elevon system, and the reason why I have it doubled up like that is so that way I can have that kind of semi aerodynamic and more structurally reliable wing. And the way I did that is I took a RoboTube Pro light and basically used that almost like as a spar to mount the elevon that's farthest to the rear. I used the RoboTube to actually mount that to. and so it basically makes it so I can add another couple of elevons out there without having them clip through some. But this is the entire reentry process, as you can see, and this was a little tricky for me to figure out how to do this because I think I was trying to get the center of mass perhaps a little farther aft than it should have been, which of course caused it to start spinning, and then of course it makes me have to pump the fuel forward to restabilize it again. But this thing is actually a lot tougher than I thought it would be, and I think a lot of that has to do with the way I designed the wings. And instead of using just simple single, we'll call it single ply wings, which is what a lot of people do, I actually took the time and kind of devised like a secondary and a tertiary wing layer on the top and the bottom. And using the strut system, it actually provides this thing a lot of structural integrity. Same thing with connecting the various segments of the fuselage together. I think the only thing this thing's really lacking is a big enough tail stabilizer, which is I think why when I try to pull up it wants to roll to one side, but that'll be a little adjustment for another day. That and taking away some of those air brakes because I didn't quite need them. But here in a couple minutes you'll get a sense of just how structurally reliable this particular spacecraft is. And this is actually what I'll call a reverse belly flop entry. And the reason why I would do this is because if you try and come in at a normal belly flop, you're actually going to cause your aircraft to start climbing again as you're decelerating. So if it's not going to be a steady rate of climb, you're actually going to end up overshooting your landing zone. Whereas if you come in at an upside down belly flop, it'll make you land short. But if you've got enough fuel to re-engage your jet engines, oh, I think here it comes. All right, I'll just let this go. I actually want this thing to try and expose some more of its underside so I get some more drag. There we go. See those G's peaking? Start to lose altitude. Now, provided this thing can actually slow down quickly enough, I don't want it to crash. I just want to get it below Mach 4, which I actually am, so I can start rolling this thing upright. And now I should actually have enough fuel. Come on. Ooh, G's are peaking. Oh boy. Oh boy. Oh boy. Come on. Look up here. Okay, now that I've let that happen, speed things back up here. But I definitely had way too many air brakes on this thing. It actually made it slow down a little too fast. So I think I'm just going to knock it back down to 4. But what I was saying is, as you can see, I got my jet engines fired up. Because if I continued on my other trajectory, obviously I would have slammed into the ground well before I hit the Kerbal Space Program. Or hit the Kerbal Spaceport. But that's the beauty of that little re-entry sequence is if you've got enough fuel to power up your jet engines again, you can easily make up for it rather than, doing a traditional belly flop entry like I started to do, and then just completely overshooting it. And in my case, before I had what's called the trajectories mod, which actually accounts for both planet rotation and drag, and actually shows you you're within, I think, about what they said, like 6 kilometers, shows you where you're actually going to land. Um, you know, I would try to do traditional belly flop. I'd end up climbing back out harder than I thought I would, and I would just completely overshoot my landing zone, which I kind of did here a little bit because the fuel tank that was actually in the cargo bay wasn't hooked up to anything, so it's actually still completely full of fuel, and it's I want to say it's like 5 tons worth of fuel. And then of course you get the other 3.2 tons of structural, payload from the actual fuel tank, the actual exterior of the fuel tank itself, as well as the structural bits I used to help kind of secure it in place. But this thing actually flies and glides very well. Again, with the air brakes, I think I slowed down a little too quickly. But this was probably the most successful spaceplane landing I've had to date, especially of this particular, simplified non-Rapier type. So, yeah, I mean, when you build your space planes, just build them empty, and provided you've got obviously enough engine power and rocket power, 130 liquid fuel and 130 oxidizer per ton. I mean, it's literally that simple. Just figuring out a little calculation, doing a little bit of multiplication, and giving your aircraft as much fuel as it needs to get up. I mean, that's it. That's all there is to it. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope this kind of gives you some ideas of your own. The mods I use in this are all going to be listed here in a couple of seconds towards the end of the video, and I hope this kind of gives you guys your own ideas. So I will definitely see you all again in the next video, and get out there and keep flying.